Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, from across the JCU community and beyond. I'd like to welcome you to the first edition of our new Conversations with Alumni webinar series. My name is Jack Rowden. I'm the Alumni Relations and Development Coordinator here at James Cook University, and I'll be hosting these panel sessions once a month, featuring some of our amazing alumni in discussions about the most pressing matters of our time. I look forward to moderating this webinar. However, before we continue, I do wish to acknowledge the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants of this country, and I pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders, past and present, of the land on which we stand today. In the spirit of reconciliation, I also acknowledge the valuable contribution that Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples continue to make to James Cook University and the broader community. Well, to all of our alumni in the audience, thank you so much for joining us. I was actually looking through our list of registrants earlier, and I was delighted to see people tuning in from India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Germany, the USA, China, Singapore, Japan, Vietnam, Papua New Guinea, and every state in Australia. And I think this really highlights the global span of our alumni community. We certainly have a global audience tonight, befitting a global topic, as we'll be exploring the current state of the world and how leadership, diplomacy, and compassion could prove vital in emerging from the difficult times which we find ourselves in at present. And what a brilliant lineup of alumni we have tonight for this first discussion. And as an alumnus of JCU myself, I'm honoured to count myself amongst the same group as our esteemed panellists who join us this evening. So first of all, I'm delighted to introduce our Chancellor, Mr. Bill Tweddell, who graduated from JCU with a Bachelor of Arts in 1972 and a Bachelor of Economics in 1976 before enjoying a long career in Australia's diplomatic service, holding roles such as the Ambassador to the Philippines, the Ambassador to Vietnam, and various other high-profile positions. Bill was actually one of our inaugural Outstanding Alumni back in 2010, and he's the first alumnus to serve as the Chancellor of the University. So welcome, Bill. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Bill is joined by Julianne Guivarra, who graduated with a Bachelor of Commerce with honours in 1997 and continues to serve as Australia's Ambassador for Gender Equality. And prior to this, she was the Ambassador to Spain, Andorra, and Equatorial Guinea, becoming Australia's first female ambassador and drawing upon experience in Australia's permanent mission to the World Trade Organization. So welcome, Julianne from Canberra.
Thanks so much, Jack.
And finally, we have Winsome Denyer, who graduated in 2008 with a Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of Journalism, and needed only 4 years to become one of our outstanding early in career alumni. As a researcher and producer on ABC's Australian Story program, Winsome has interviewed some amazing people, and I truly look forward to hearing her thoughts on the state of the world and its leadership from a media perspective. So welcome, Winsome from Sydney.
Thank you.
And just for our audience, should you have any questions that you'd like one of our three panellists to address, please pop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will endeavour to get them answered at some stage, probably towards the end of the webinar. Well, we only have an hour to discuss some very poignant topics, so let's get straight into it. Chancellor, I will start with you. You enjoyed a long career in Australia's diplomatic service, throughout which you've witnessed, experienced, and responded to some major crises. And I actually recall an alumni event in Melbourne where you were telling me some incredible stories about aircraft hijackings in Bangladesh and Greece, and a humanitarian crisis after Typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines. Clearly, you've been an informed witness to many chapters of our modern history. How do you perceive the state of the world at present amidst such things as the coronavirus, rising political polarity, and a profound economic downturn?
Thanks very much, Jack, and good evening, everybody, and special thanks to Julianne and to Winsome. Look, the initial point I think we need to make about COVID-19, which is the context in which we're discussing things, is that the COVID-19, like many crises, accelerates trends rather than creates new ones, typically. The pandemic and its intersection with world developments throw up a number of questions, in my mind, about the outlook for international relations. Prominent among these are the future leadership within the United States, the role which the US seeks to play globally, how China conducts itself on the world stage, how other countries respond to that, and particularly the trajectory of US-China relations and the efficacy and future of global institutions and multilateralism in general. So regardless of the outcome of the US presidential election in November, I think we can expect that US self-assertion and assumed world leadership, if you like, US exceptionalism and assumed primacy, is ingrained and expected. The winner will have to place more focus on US renewal after the devastation of the pandemic, and US strength as a global leader depends crucially on strength at home. The US-China relationship is moving to an entirely new phase. The US sees China more sharply as a threat to US primacy. And the big question, of course, is where that will take US policy. Though superficially attractive to some, a containment policy would be doomed to failure and disastrous, including for Australia. So, however, pressures to move in that direction are, however, possible, whoever wins the US presidential election. Engaging with and constraining China, not seeking to contain it, is really the way to go. How to prevent being eclipsed by China without resorting to containment, though, is the challenge faced by all nations. In the US, Biden would probably be less erratic than Mr. Trump, so a steadier approach is more likely from him. It's possible, however, that Biden will be forced to adopt more extreme positions to win election, and for it then to take some time for him to walk back from them afterwards. So to that extent, China has overplayed its hand, I'd argue, with its recent more pugnacious approach, making it more likely that Biden will be pressed to show he is no patsy, or choose your word, on China. In fact, China seems to be fighting with everyone. Pakistan and North Korea, frankly, are the only exceptions that come readily to mind. So unpleasant as it is for us, Australia is not the only country with which China is being unusually aggressive at present. It's not clear to me or to others I've consulted who are experts in China. It's not clear why this is so. It might be premature arrogance or perhaps something wrong with the normally more measured decision-making processes in China. So what countries like the Quad members, Australia, India, Japan and the US, do about drawing a line, not militarily, but diplomatically, is key to all this. For those who don't know, the Quad is the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is an informal strategic forum involving those countries I mentioned. And it was initiated in 2007 by Shinzo Abe of Japan and revived in its current form in 2017. So if the US, for example, tries to make the Quad a vehicle for, or a venue for, a containment strategy with China, I think we could be expecting the others to resist. So who else? I've mentioned the US and China because of their obvious preeminence. Among countries other than China, which might bear watching, I think Russia's often mentioned, but Russia, to put it simply, I think is a spoiler, not a shaper in world events. What Russia might seek to achieve in concert with China is another matter, and it's an interesting one, but China-Russia relations are pretty hard to project. The two of them, I think, are likely to have some enduring common interests, including clipping the US's wings, but China's approach will be opportunistic, embracing Russia when and only when it suits their interests. China-India is a relationship worth watching. China's approach is likely to push India closer to the US and the other countries of the Quad, and we have a reminder of just how tensions can bubble up to the surface between those two countries just perennially, just recently in the middle of June in Ladakh. In our part of the world, Japan, India, and perhaps, but less likely, Indonesia are determined to prevent China from becoming a global power, but frankly, more likely to sit on their hands. Southeast Asia, unfortunately, will most likely drift more and more into China's orbit. Why, after all, would they stand up to China at the moment, given the high risk that, particularly under Mr. Trump, they could not trust the US to back them? The US, in short, has for them, I think, become something of an unreliable ally, and countries aren't sure that their back is covered. In foreign policy, Trump, if I may say so, like most bullies, is a bit of a coward. Witness his approach to dictators in Russia, North Korea, Turkey, and elsewhere, in contrast to the tougher, more transactional approach with leaders of traditionally friendly countries like Canada, the UK, Germany, and even Australia. I think we could be expected that there would be a different approach from President Biden, if that's what comes about, including more attention to allies. But having said that, and I don't resile from it, Trump hasn't been all bad news for our region. He's allowed the US Navy to challenge China's preposterous 9-dash line claims in the South China Sea and to assert itself in the Taiwan Strait, for example. And he does favour Australia's inclusion in the G7, along with Russia, South Korea and India. Now, if I may turn to the other area that I was hoping to cover rather quickly, though, multilateralism. So on the one hand, COVID-19 is a stark reminder of just how crucial life and death issues can transcend national boundaries and demand global solutions. But the outlook, I have to say, is mixed on whether that means that nations will now be more likely to embrace global approaches to transnational challenges, like climate change, obviously, and international trade. Trump is a unilateralist who moreover sees the world in trade, not geopolitical terms. It's likely that the US under Biden would return to a more emphasis on multilateralism, for example, possibly returning to the Paris Accords. But COVID-19 has created a recession which will not be short-lived and which will have global ramifications. Well, that's pretty obvious, isn't it? But trade will drop considerably. Consumption will drop as spending slows. So economies like Australia's that are highly dependent on trade, and particularly in our case with Asia, will face large challenges. One outcome will be a call for less dependence on global supply chains and a greater self-reliance within nations. We're already seeing some of that in Australia. And a country as export reliant as we in Australia are should be very wary, though, of this double-edged sword. Our own exports will face stiff challenges in other countries if they adopt similar practices and policies. So while the COVID-19 pandemic is a reminder that some challenges are truly global, as I said, and that global approaches and robust international institutions and multilateral institutions are essential, sadly, the takeout by many, perhaps most governments, is likely to be that multilateral institutions failed to rise to the occasion. Making them fitter for purpose will appeal, unfortunately, less than bypassing them. And in this, it has to be said that multilateral institutions have not helped themselves. For example, the WTO, on which obviously Julianne's much more expert than I am, has probably become less and less relevant and effective since the end of the Uruguay round. The G20 didn't step up to the plate on COVID-19 as it had done on the global financial crisis. And there's some truth to the idea that the WHO has become less and less effective and more captured by China, enough anyway for Trump to be able to use that as to divert attention from his own inadequate response to COVID-19. There's a lot of US comment in my remarks. US relations are crucially and centrally important in this connection that I've just been talking about. What can you do globally if the major world power is not interested in global approaches? So although, as mentioned earlier, a Biden presidency would likely be more responsive to global approaches than the current administration, how deep and how quick that change come would be uncertain. Against that background, I think we might be able to expect that so-called coalitions of the willing might be more likely, focused on shared interests in certain areas, and that includes climate change. Though under Biden, the US would come back to the table on climate change, we'd hope. He would not be particularly encouraging on global trade matters. Again, I defer to the expertise of Julianne, but for example, it seems unlikely he would take the US back into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. For their part, middle powers like Australia can achieve a great deal through persuasion and through design of solutions and responses to global challenges. But as I say, real change needs the great powers, at least tacitly. Look, there are other international trends that could explore now if our time was less limited. One, I think, would be the impact of the pandemic on Europe. Although there were some very inauspicious early wobbles, one impact might well be to create greater and better unity within Europe. And as we saw with the WHO resolution on the impartial examination of the origins of COVID-19, there can be very effective cooperation between Australia and Europe in certain cases where core interests and values are shared. And finally, I think the whole discussion of its own, a whole discussion of its own could revolve around the fact that at a time when the rates of the world's needy seem certain to swell, and they are swelling under the impact of the pandemic, the pressure on national and international aid budgets and aid institutions is also going to be affected by the economic impacts of the pandemic. And subsets of that problem might include, for example, stalling or backsliding on programs focused on gender equity, on which, of course, I again defer to my learned colleague. So let me stop there, Jack.
Yep,
thank you for the opportunity.
That's perfect, Bill. I think that's a really fantastic, but quite concerning encapsulation of the world, how it stands geopolitically now. So, Julianne, I will cross to you now, and I'm interested to sort of build on some points that Bill made about multilateralism in regards to trade. So, you very recently departed the role of Australia's ambassador to Spain. Shortly after you left, Spain did experience, a catastrophic coronavirus outbreak with an awful human toll. And I think, we all watched with horror at that. So I think we're familiar with this. However, I would be interested to hear your thoughts as a practitioner in the global trade space as to how you see the world emerging economically from this crisis. I mean, we've seen millions unemployed, industries in turmoil, oil futures plunge into the negatives. So what does the roadmap to regain prosperity look like in your view? And building on what Bill said, I mean, how do organisations such as the World Trade Organization play a role in this recovery, with the world seeming to be withdrawing from multilateralism?
Thanks, Jack. And yes, thanks to Bill for the fantastic overview of some of the issues that we're currently confronted with internationally. I mean, certainly it's fair to say COVID-19 is a significant challenge, and quite unlike ones we've seen over the most recent decades. It's different, I guess, to some of the other challenges that the region has faced most recently. Similarly, the global financial crisis, or if you go back to the late 90s and the Asian financial crisis, I mean, this is multifaceted. You have health issues, social issues, and economic issues all interwoven. And I think that's what makes this crisis quite unlike many that we've confronted in recent decades. Of course, Australia has had 29 years of uninterrupted economic growth until this year, of course. And that's largely as a result of the fact that our region has been one of the real growth engines of the world over the last 3 to 4 decades. About 2/3, in fact, of the world's economic growth, of course, comes from our region. So, our exporters of goods and services have all benefited, of course, from this growth trajectory. And right now, I guess it's really difficult to predict at this stage exactly what will happen as a result of, in terms of the medium to longer term consequences of COVID-19. Certainly, the most recent IMF World Economic Outlook figures, which they updated in June, suggested that for this year, it will be a negative 4.9% growth projection for the world, so that's globally. They are, of course, predicting more positive growth in 2021, but I think that still very much depends on how the world continues to kind of manage the health crisis. I mean, we are seeing some countries experience their second waves now, of course, of the pandemic. So, how the region recovers and will be quite a significant thing in terms of how Australia, in fact, recovers as well. I mean, because of our economy being so integrally linked with the rest of the region. Of course, as Bill mentioned, it would be remiss of me not to talk about these current issues and not reflect on my current role as Ambassador for Gender Equality, because we are, of course, seeing this pandemic having a disproportionate impact on women and girls. That's true in the Indo-Pacific region where we are, but it's also true globally. I mean, women have been at the front line of the pandemic, as we have 70% of healthcare workers globally are in fact women. Unfortunately, we are seeing quite significant spikes in gender-based violence, and that's a phenomenon not only in our region, but also globally. It just so happens, though, in the Indo-Pacific, intimate partner violence is twice as prevalent as other parts of the world. So, you know, at this sort of time when, because of different measures that, you know, governments have obviously had to take because of health reasons, you find women, of course, you know, trapped in their homes with perpetrators of violence. So this is one thing that I think, you know, most governments are very seized of, and certainly the Australian government is very seized of. Domestically, they launched a gender violence package domestically, but of course, the foreign minister has also been having various meetings, including with Pacific women leaders about these types of issues only a matter of a few weeks ago. So we really do need to see this as, a crisis that's impacting not only on economies, but of course economies impact on the social fabric of many of our neighbours in the region. And I think that's something that Australia obviously is really quite concerned about. I mean, for Australia, as Bill mentioned, it's really important for us to maintain sort of free, open and predictable markets. That's both trade and investment. You know, we've been as Bill mentioned, a very successful exporting nation. In fact, it's about 3/4 of our agricultural exports are, in fact, 3/4 of our agricultural production is, of course, exported. So it's really quite important for Australia that those markets remain open. And despite these tendencies that we do see of nationalism and protectionism, that's something I think, you know, we are really quite conscious of. And, you know, you've probably seen the Trade Minister speaking on these particular issues. I think, you know, what Australia wants to see coming out of this crisis, of course, is something that we mentioned, of course, in the white paper as well, which is, of course, a stable, resilient and prosperous region. And I guess partly to achieve that, you know, the government just a matter of a few weeks ago launched what they've described as a Partnerships for Recovery, which looks at, you know, basically providing development assistance, particularly to our region, focused primarily on the Pacific. Because we have seen in many of the Pacific nations, even though they may not have had a single COVID virus case, they are, of course, impacted by the border closures. So for economies that depend so heavily on sectors such as tourism, remittances, of course, from their workers who work overseas, it's had quite a devastating effect on many economies in the Pacific. So the Australian government launched Partnerships for Recovery to ensure that we can provide assistance to our neighbours. So it's a really complex picture. It's still very early days to tell, you know, what the longer term consequences are for both the global economy, but also for Australia, I think.
Excellent, Gillian. That's a very good encapsulation as well. So I would like to get back to you a bit later on in the session about the impact on the SDGs behind you there. So I'll save that question for later. Winsome, I'm going to turn to you now. Let's bring the focus now to Australia, perhaps. You recently ran an episode of Australian Story, which explored the impact of the pandemic on Australians at a personal level. I think, you know, we're all living this experience as we speak, and obviously with the events in Victoria, watching on, pretty concerned with that. However, beyond the coronavirus now and its economic impact, what are some other pressing issues facing Australians as we head into the 2020s, a new decade?
Well, it is, you know, as Julianne was saying, it is very early days, and it is difficult to imagine life post this pandemic at the moment, but it's a big question too. But I guess existentially, you know, climate change for Australians as well as everyone around the world is still such a huge issue. And this pandemic situation has shown what can happen when air travel suddenly, stops. And manufacturing in China, you know, there were blue skies over China during this time. And so I think it's shown this moment in time has really shown us perhaps what what we've just become used to and what is normal for us, which is actually, really, really impacting the world around us. And, of course, experts at James Cook Uni know this as well as anyone, that there are more extreme weather predictions coming. We've had the bushfires just this summer. Townsville had the huge flood the summer before. How are we going to cope with these events when they keep happening? And it'll be really interesting to see as this pandemic subsides, as we hopefully find a solution to this illness, that what's going to happen on the conversation of climate change. So I think that's certainly going to be front and centre for the next decade in Australia. Looking more just domestically at our own society, I think reconciliation with our Indigenous community is incredibly important, and it's something that has been continuing to be discussed. I know Minister Ken Wyatt is trying to work with his colleague Linda Burney to work towards some kind of reconciliation path and hold a referendum. And I mean, we think about the Statement of the Heart from Uluru that happened back in 2017, which is 3 years ago now. We've just seen a new wave of protests despite the pandemic, where people are talking about Black deaths in custody. Obviously, that was inspired by what was going on in the US, but we're going to keep seeing the societal fracture in Australia unless it's truly addressed. So I think that's something else that we really need to focus on and have some serious action on within this next decade. And then, of course, a huge thing is going to be how our relations with foreign governments continue. And Bill discussed this really well and is far more of an expert on it than me, but our relations with China are so tense at the moment. How are we going to navigate that? How does that work with our existing relationship with the US? We're incredibly reliant on China. We have a lot of Chinese students coming. There's a lot of investment in Australia. How is that going to play out in the next decade? It's another big question. There's plenty of other issues, I suppose, but they were just some of the ones that came to mind when I was thinking it through.
Yeah, and look, I think it's very interesting that you've brought all those up, Winsome, and you mentioned some of humanity's greatest challenges of all time, and I think it's interesting to see with the coronavirus how a lot of those problems have seemed to be put on the back burner, certainly in the media and with society's attention. So it'll be very interesting to see how we I suppose grapple with what's going to be a very seminal decade in our history. So thank you all for your thoughts so far and where we stand currently, and for identifying some of the many challenges that we do face both as Australians and a global society. These certainly are times of adversity. So now I'd like to sort of steer the conversation towards how we emerge from this era. And, as the theme of our webinar suggests, I would like to frame the conversation around leadership, diplomacy, and compassion, and how important these aspects might be to the recovery and the advancement of our society. So, Bill, I will start with you. Throughout your lengthy career, you've met and hosted some of the world's foremost leaders, prime ministers, ambassadors, royalty even. In your eyes, which characteristics define sound leadership? And can you point to some examples from the popular geopolitical realm that you were mentioning before, where competency in leadership has made a significant difference in crisis response? Oh, sorry, Bill, might have to... There we go.
Sorry about that. Yeah, look, thank you, Jack, for that. I mean, let's start with the definition. I think the simple definition of leadership is the art of motivating people to act towards achieving a common goal, right? I think we probably all agree with that, of being able and prepared to inspire other people. Effective leadership is based on ideas, whether they're your own or borrowed from others, but won't happen. Effective leadership won't happen unless those ideas can be communicated to other people or others, other nations, in a way that engages them to act as the leader is seeking to have them act. I think also a leader is someone who can see how things can be improved and who rallies people to move toward that better vision. Leaders, I think, can work towards making their vision a reality, but just being able to motivate people isn't enough. Leaders need to be empathetic and connect with people to be successful. And in short, I think leaders are there to heal and to unite and not to divide. I think another characteristic is that true leaders, and this applies to countries as well as to individuals, act with integrity, and in doing so, they establish trust. I think also the best of national leaders also find and express the voice of their nation in a time of crisis. So if these definitions are valid, and I think they are, who among past and present leaders cuts the mustard and who doesn't? So let's start with the obvious and topical point. I think by any measure, Donald Trump is a clear example of how not to lead. He's been found sadly wanting in his response to two major and overlapping crises, COVID-19 and the existential, really, protests sparked by the killing of George Floyd in the custody of Minneapolis police. In other words, the Black Lives Matter controversy. He's shown himself to be dangerously incompetent and unprincipled. He refuses to accept responsibility and is a stranger to any concept of integrity or uniting rather than dividing his people. Someone recently described Trump's coronavirus media briefings, which are now mercifully abandoned for the wrong reasons, as our quote, free-form, fact-deficient, stream of consciousness ramblings, full of fantasy and off-the-wall pronouncements based on his intuition, guesswork, and opinions of Fox News TV hosts and social media misinformation. That's the end of the quote. And I think that sums up a lot of what's wrong about that style of leadership. But let me, having defined the positive by, I think, an outstanding example of the opposite, I think there are a few leaders of whom I've had personal experience, so I'll start with them and then move on to a few others of whom I do not have personal experience. The one which I'd single out first, because it was the one I was most intimately involved with, would be to commend the leadership of John Howard, Peter Costello, and Alexander Downer for the leadership they displayed in response to the Asian financial crisis. I was at the time Downer's Chief of Staff, so I was in a ringside seat on that. Kevin Rudd, I think, needs to be commended for the role he played both within Australia, but globally as well through the G20 in response to the global financial crisis to which Julianne has referred earlier. I think it's only fair to commend our current Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, for the leadership of the response to COVID-19, activating and respecting the National Cabinet process and ensuring a prominent and public role for genuine expertise on the subject. I think Tony Blair has to be commended in his own way for the strong leadership he showed in modernising the perennially utterly unelectable British Labour Party and leading them back into government. And he spoke very eloquently for his nation at the time of great division following the death of Princess Diana. I think close to home, Jacinda Ardern deserves recognition for her response to the Christchurch hate killings and also for her leadership of the response to COVID-19. Chris Patten makes my list, and that may surprise you a little, but he's somebody I know. The poor man, God knows what he'd be making of the current state of play in Hong Kong, but he was a man and is a man of character and personality, and he showed significant leadership in playing a very weak hand that he was dealt as the last governor of Hong Kong. So those are people of whom I have personal experience. Those not known to me, I mean, the list is endless, isn't it, really? And happily, I'd single out Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, in fact. He was the founder and the first president from 1923 to 1938, I think it was, when he died, of the Republic of Turkey. He led his country into a modern, secular, industrial nation. It's often said, of course, in our part of the world that two nations came of age at Gallipoli, Australia and New Zealand. Well, I'd add Turkey to that list because it was then Colonel Mustafa Kemal's leadership at a crucial period of the Gallipoli campaign that put him on the path to the nation-shaping leader that he later became. The poor man, of course, would be spinning in his grave right now at the sort of pandering that's going on by the current leadership. Winston Churchill, controversial figure, but obviously enough, I think he deserves credit for the leadership he's displayed in the UK through some of the most profound wartime challenges imaginable. I'll finish my list. It could go on. The Dalai Lama, who he's somebody I have met, but Nelson Mandela, obvious choice, who led with courage and lived up to his promises. But I'll leave that list. I'm sure that others could think of many. Winsome, I think, would know some, and also Julianne. But I think that what they have in common there is being able to inspire people and to unite rather than to divide people who depend on them for the lead that they show in so many ways in terms of values and so forth.
Well, that's very interesting that you do finish with that, Bill, because I mentioned earlier when introducing this panel session, and now we've mentioned it a couple of times as well, that the last 10 years has seen a real drastic increase in the polarity of politics. And it's fair to say that the 2010s, were a decade of growing division, both within societies and between societies. So, Julianne, I'll move to you now. In times like these, how important to the success of our global society is diplomacy, both at the macro level, in which you yourself are a practitioner, but also at the micro level, where as individuals, we all have a role to play in embracing change and diversity of opinion. Oh, we just needed to unmute yourself there, Julianne.
Sorry. Yeah,
you
thank you.
No,
thank you. I was just saying, no, I think it is very important, obviously, to use your diplomatic tools at times like this, for the reasons that Bill had stated very early on. I mean, obviously, we have just seen, of course, the government just this past week released its defence strategy, which talks about, a more uncertain geostrategic environment, which we find ourselves now with greater, geostrategic competition in our region. The foreign policy white paper, which was launched back in 2017, talked about some of these issues, of course, rising populism, growing protectionism, new non-state actors, and of course, new threats like cybersecurity. And as Bill said, it's not that COVID-19 has sort of changed that course at all. It may have just accelerated some of those trends. And I think, that's something that obviously when we look at, how we deploy our diplomatic tools, it's really on those sorts of issues that we are looking at right now. So really, it's more important than ever that we use all that we have in our armament in that regard. As you say, it's not just a matter for diplomats. Obviously, the kind of people-to-people links. Really, that's what you are looking at. Trying to build understandings between societies, and that comes from many areas, including the education sector. So. The links that you can establish, through education institutions like James Cook University, who has campuses in Singapore and other parts of the world. I mean, those types of links are really important, and they help create an image of Australia. And I think, that's something that is really important. Obviously, we need to build influence through effective and practical cooperation. And I think that's something, the Australian Diplomatic Corps has always been very successful at. I love a phrase used by a former secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Peter Varghese. He said, Australia can neither buy or bully our way in or out of anything in the world. And that is absolutely true. We are a classic kind of middle power. And in that case, we really need to build coalitions and cooperation amongst countries. And of course, yes, my trade background, I mean, we were very successful doing it in the 80s when we formed what's known as the Cairns Group, which was there about sort of trying to establish new rules on agricultural trade back in the World Trade Organization when it was established. But more contemporary examples of, I guess, the G20 leaders meeting came into being partly because of, Australian advocacy on it during the global financial crisis. I mean, it was, eventually settled that it would happen in the US, but Australia was really quite key in pushing for that. And of course, more recently, we've forged ahead with free trade agreements in our region to try and, build greater cohesiveness to kind of continue that rules-based order in our own region when the likes of the US, pulled out. So of course, the example there being the Comprehensive Partnership Agreement towards the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And we're still doing it. So we're still in a live negotiation at the moment on the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which includes China and others. So I think, we have a very strong tradition in Australia of trying to pull together coalitions to confront, difficult challenges. And I think, at this particular time, as you say, when it looks like, the fabrics in some way are fraying, it's really incumbent on countries like Australia to kind of come into action and really address some of these issues. I mean, it's interesting too. I mean, in my sort of 20 odd years in the diplomatic service in Australia, I've seen it changing quite a bit. And this is where that kind of compassion and showing more of what Australia is to the world has changed, I think. And, I mean, we now have over 42% of our ambassadors are women. So that's gone up. I think when we actually introduced a women in leadership strategy back in, I think it was about 2015. And at that stage, we had something like 27% of our ambassadors were women, and now we're up to 42%. And as you say, I was the first female Indigenous ambassador. And again, having, Indigenous representation amongst our diplomatic corps, I think is really an important thing for Australia to show the world who we are, because we are a very, multicultural society. And at times like this, where you're having to reach out to different parts of the world to try and come to terms with new challenges, that sort of diversity is really, an asset. So I think, we're starting from a good stead, not only in our diplomatic service, but also in our society as well.
It's a great point, Julianne, at the end. I think that's fantastic. I do have a question for you, but I will cross now to Winsome. Over the past 5 years, as these sort of socio-political shifts have occurred, we've seen immense changes in political leadership styles, I guess, around the world. And Bill definitely referred to those and covered those really well. But also there's been changes in the way that leaders have conveyed their messages to the public during and outside times of crisis. So, I mean, as someone who's forging, a very successful career in the communicative media sector, I'd be interested to hear your take on the significance of quality and compassionate communication by leaders during difficult times. And, I was thinking perhaps, maybe you could talk a little bit about Shane Fitzsimmons, who featured on Australian Story just recently.
Well, it's something that really stands leaders apart when there's a crisis, doesn't it? And, I moved to Sydney 10 years ago as a founding team member of the ABC's news channel. And so I'm very fond of the 24-hour news format and what we were able to achieve with that and its ongoing worth. And it's particularly a fantastic service in times like these where we've got constant information coming out and we can be informing the public 24/7. And similarly, social media platforms are used in that way now too. There's that 24-hour news cycle. But I have often reflected on how that 24-hour news cycle has also changed the way leaders communicate, because inevitably there's more space to fill. So at times when there aren't emergencies, there's a lot more conjecture, there's a lot more filling of time. And, in times past where a politician might give a press conference and you just hear a few select portions of it on the 7 p.m. news, now we take the press conference in full. And it's a lot more scrutiny and exposure of politicians. And inevitably they become a lot more rehearsed and guarded because they get picked up on every little thing that they do. So, I think in some ways, while it's given politicians more opportunity to communicate and through social media as well, often in a more direct way, it's also adding to that scrutiny, which then makes them more wooden, more rehearsed, and then you lose that genuine element. And as Bill was discussing with some of those examples, I think when someone is truly genuine, that's where good leadership comes from. And you mentioned Shane Fitzsimmons, Jack, who was led the New South Wales Rural Fire Service response to the bushfires this summer. He's a great example of someone who is a truly genuine and empathetic person. The first Australian Story episode I ever worked on was about Ricky Ponting, the cricket captain. And I remember somebody, I think it might have been Justin Langer, said that, you know, he was a great leader because he led from the front. And I think that's exactly the same situation with Shane Fitzsimmons. He's somebody that's been at the front line, that's fought fires himself. You could just see in the way that he communicated that, he had genuine empathy and compassion, not only for the communities being affected, but also for the fireys that were there trying to fight these fires. And I think those things about him really won the trust of the public, and he was believed, and people followed everything that he said. Whereas I think, you know, we have so much fake news going around now. People are often listening to, because people can curate their own news, they're listening in these echo chambers and just listening to people that they agree with. And we're seeing a greater, more cuts to newsrooms, which means a degradation of long form, important journalism that can really be control the spread of fake news. So I think there are a lot of factors at play where a lot of politicians these days have fears about how they're going to come across, and that can really affect the way that they are perceived. And, you know, Jacinda Ardern is another great example of where that response to the Christchurch massacre, it was like she didn't care what people thought. She did what she thought was right. She got down there amongst the people who were affected. And that was such a powerful thing to see in a world where everything is so rehearsed.
I think that's a wonderful point at the end there. And, you know, I think, we've been talking about compassion, and you mentioned its application and communication. It's just so valuable. I think people certainly become vested in the person who's delivering those messages. And as a cricket tragic myself, I think it's wonderful you mentioned Ricky Ponting, our best batsman, I think, of the last 25 years. And I'm sure Bill would agree. So, look, thank you very much, Winston. We do only have about 12 minutes to go, so I'd love to get some questions. First of all, Bill, you've received a bit of a pat on the back from one of our anonymous attendees. He said, with Bill's impressive political knowledge and insights, I'd be interested to hear about his opinion of South Africa's current political leadership. So what are your thoughts there, Bill?
Oh, God, look, I'm sorry, having been so opinionated about some other countries' leaders, I don't really know much about it. In as much as it's about 5 years since I left the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, so I'm not getting to see much of that. My last job in Canberra before I went off to the Philippines was, in fact, to head the area dealing with the Americas, so I would have been a bit more use back in about 2011. I don't know whether, Julianne, you can be much help to me here, but I think that the challenges in South Africa are enormous. I think that for a country that had 20% of its population subjugated for so long, and then to have the amazing good fortune of having a leader who was so courageous and so forgiving, and so many of the other things that we've been talking about that are important in leaders. But I really am short on useful views to share, I'm sorry, with our anonymous questioner about that. I don't know whether Winston, through her contacts, or Julianne can do a better job than I just did.
Well, Julianne, I'll pass over to you.
Yes, sorry. No, I mean, I don't really know a lot at the moment about, it's not sort of my sphere of general day-to-day work, but certainly I know that obviously in Africa more generally, obviously the COVID pandemic, the impacts that it's having on many societies across Africa is quite significant. I mean, the interesting thing about COVID and the way that it's worked is you've seen, of course, a lot of the developed countries affected first, but now what we're seeing is, of course, it moving more and more into developing economies across the globe. And certainly from some of the conversations I've had in relation to kind of gender related issues, we are sort of picking up some sort of intelligence around, you know, impacts of COVID on women in societies in Africa. And that's not just about, you know, them actually contracting the virus, but it's actually things like diversion of resources away from some of the other healthcare issues that, you know, obviously the provision of maternal health care to women, those sorts of issues when health sectors you know, are on the verge of real sort of collapse and pressures. You're seeing a lot of, you know, resource being diverted away from provision of essential services in some of these areas. So I know that's a concern, obviously, for women there. And indeed, the issue that I raised very early on about gender-based violence, you know, I have heard of reports in Africa as well of spikes in gender-based violence as a result of the lockdowns, you know, applied during COVID.
So on that note there, Julianne, I did mention earlier that I'd like to ask a bit of a question about the Sustainable Development Goals. So behind you there, you've got the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which is probably the most concerted effort by humanity to create a better world on the 2030 agenda. So we've only got 10 years until 2030. How has coronavirus, has it taken the focus off the SDGs, or how has it constrained certain elements of them, or?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jack. I mean, certainly what we are seeing, as I said, because of, if you look at what the latest statistics are from the IMF and the World Bank, everyone is pointing to the fact that, you know, we're at real risk of losing some of the development gains that we have won around the world, you know, over the last few decades. And I think, you know, a lot of economies globally are very seized of the fact that, you know, this could have quite devastating effects on some of the most marginalized groups in, you know, across the globe. So that is a concern that I think, you know, many in the international community are quite seized of. Yep. And certainly, as I mentioned, the Australian government has just launched, you know, a Partnerships for Recovery strategy, which really is focused on how we can assist, you know, countries in our own region. So a lot of it, of course, is oriented towards the Indo-Pacific region, how we can assist them most immediately, whether that be through, in the early days, of course, the provision of sort of health supplies, but sort of longer term, how we can help with their sort of economic recovery and you know, their economic trajectory. So these are really pressing and challenging times for us to achieve the SDGs by 2030. And certainly just the pressures on developed economies as well. I mean, obviously, I think Bill might have mentioned, I mean, the resource pressures that we have to tackle issues at home. You know, obviously there is a balance to be made there. But I mean, I think, you know, for governments like Australia, we see, you know, our own security and stability of our region so linked to what happens with the future of Australia that we can't really afford to completely withdraw from, you know, provision of assistance and aid to the region. We really have to continue that because it's so vital to our own prosperity and security in the longer term.
Excellent. Yeah, you've just answered one of the questions here from David, which is, that's excellent. Now, Winsome, we are running out of time here, but if just thought we might end on a bit of a positive if we can. It's been a little bit of a sort of grim session, but such are the times. Winsome, have you seen any grassroots efforts? I mean, you go out and you talk to people, interesting Australians all the time as part of the Australian story. Is there anything spring to mind, some grassroots efforts that have made a difference in Australia in response to COVID-19? Sorry to put you on the spot, by the way, too.
Well, you know, I mean, I think the first thing that springs to mind is on the ABC at the moment, they've got a promo running, which is a montage of it. Initially starts with these more grim themes of, you know, illness and recession and this kind of thing. But then it also highlights the fact that, you know, families and communities have shown great resilience and really pulled together during these times. And despite the physical separations that we've had, in some ways people are more connected. I mean, just personally, I know I've had kind of Zoom catch-ups with friends which we could have done at any time, you know, all around the world. But it's only because of this situation that we are doing that. And I think a lot of people are really getting out there and coming together as communities, and neighbours who perhaps didn't speak to each other before are actually finding out who lives next door and how they might be able to help if it's somebody who's elderly or perhaps has a health condition that's preventing them from being able to, you know, be out and about in society. So there's certainly been some great silver linings to this issue, and a lot of young people getting out there and helping the elders in our community, which is a really lovely thing to see too.
Definitely. I think there's always opportunities and optimism in the adversity that we've spoke about throughout the session. Unfortunately, we're starting to get towards the end of time now. So I would like to say a very sincere thank you to all three of our esteemed alumni panelists. I really appreciate your time, and I'm sure the audience does as well. It really has been a privilege discussing the present state of the world with you and hearing your informed insights, as I think we all try to make sense of and navigate a complex and intricate global society from day to day. So in wishing you all the best, all three of you, all the best for the future, this does conclude our first Conversations with Alumni panel session. I hope our audience enjoyed this, as I said, and our next event will be on the 12th of August. That's also Wednesday. And we're going to take this conversation forward to actually explore the big challenges that humanity faces. And we did mention some of these in the form of adapting to climate change, life with artificial intelligence, and also rising inequalities. So our next session will actually explore the latter, and our panelists will, of course, be alumni, and we look forward to announcing them to you in due course. In the meantime, just a message for all of our alumni. Stay up to date with all things JCU and alumni related on our social media, on Facebook, LinkedIn. And for those of you who are alumni listening, please visit our website and make sure your details are up to date so that we can send you an invitation to more of these sessions and hopefully some more networking events either at the back end of this year or next year, depending on how COVID-19 pans out. So thank you all very much for listening. And wherever you are around the world, we wish you, our JCU alumni family, many safe and happy returns and good luck with the future. Good evening.